The sun lazily filtered through the translucent curtains in the living room, casting light on the shelves I had been unsuccessfully trying to organize for the past half hour. The scent of lemon-scented furniture polish mingled with the faint aroma of coffee wafting from the kitchen. At that moment, I heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. Someone had entered the house. It was Louis, my stepson. Tall, slightly disheveled, with chestnut hair that always seemed a bit tousled. He had come home earlier than usual, and it was immediately noticeable. Normally, Louis worked late into the evening at the coffee shop and then lingered with friends. But now he stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame as if observing something. "Hey," he said. His voice was calm. Too calm for someone who had unexpectedly shown up in the middle of a workday. "You're not someone I often see with a cleaning rag in hand?" I nearly dropped the bottle of polish. His words caught me off guard. Trying to mask my awkwardness, I forced a smile. "Well, someone has to do it. Have you seen how much dust is in here?" I replied, waving the rag toward the shelf. Louis leaned against the wall, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jeans. He tilted his head slightly, studying me as though I wasn't the lady of the house, but a character in one of his books. There was something strange in his gaze, something that made me feel uneasy, as if he saw more than he should. "You look like you're trying to wipe away more than just dust," he said, his tone half joking, half serious. I froze. What did he mean by that? Those words, though spoken lightly, struck deeper than I expected. "Work always helps take your mind off things," I replied, trying to avoid a direct answer. Louis nodded but didn't move. We stood in silence, and that silence weighed on me, as if there was an unspoken question hanging between us that neither of us dared to voice. "You're early today," I finally said, breaking the pause. "My shift partner asked me to cover for him this evening. I figured I could take some time to relax," he said with a shrug, as if it didn't matter. "And you? Why are you alone? Where's Paul?" "He's at work," I replied, hearing how loud my voice sounded. I quickly added, "As usual, nothing new?" Louis smirked and looked away. His face suddenly seemed older than his years, carrying a weariness no 24-year-old should have. "Maybe you'd like some coffee?" I offered, trying to restore some normalcy to the moment. "No thanks," he said, "but if you need anything, I'm around." He turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone in the living room with a rag in my hand and a swirl of unspoken thoughts. Why had this short, seemingly insignificant interaction affected me so much? What was the strange feeling left behind by his words? I returned to cleaning, but noticed my hands were trembling. It felt as though all this time I hadn't been wiping dust off the shelves, but something far harder to erase with just a simple swipe. Evening crept in unnoticed. The sunlight had given way to the soft glow of a table lamp illuminating the living room. I sat on the couch, trying to focus on a book, but the words on the pages refused to form coherent sentences. My thoughts still lingered on the morning conversation with Louis. I heard footsteps. Louis entered the room with a mug in his hand and settled into the armchair opposite me. He looked relaxed, but his eyes were fixed on me, focused and intent. "You've been on your feet all day," he remarked casually. "Why go to so much effort? It's just a house." His question was simple, but it carried a surprising sincerity. He genuinely seemed to want to understand why I was so consumed by cleaning. "Sometimes you just want things to be in order," I replied, keeping my eyes on the book. "It helps to feel like I have control over something." Louis leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "And what are you trying to control?" he asked, his tone devoid of mockery, filled only with genuine curiosity. I hesitated. His directness always caught me off guard. He had a way of asking questions as if he knew there was more behind them than a simple answer. "Sometimes it's just a habit, Louis," I said with a shrug. "We all find ways to distract ourselves." He looked thoughtfully out the window. "Yeah, distraction is convenient," he said, as though he was speaking about more than just me. "I try to distract myself too, but lately it hasn't been working very well." And you? He asked suddenly. What do you think about when you're alone? Different things, I finally said. The past? What could have been different? I guess that's normal for everyone. Lewis studied me for a long moment, as if trying to uncover the truth behind my words. Then he leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. I think you underestimate how much you reveal about yourself, even when you say different things. There was something oddly reassuring in his tone. I felt both exposed and understood at the same time. You're too observant, I muttered with a faint smile, trying to lighten the mood. That's not such a bad thing, is it? He replied, smiling back. At that moment, I couldn't quite grasp what made this conversation feel so significant. But when Lewis left the room, I sensed that something invisible had passed between us, something that couldn't be undone or forgotten. The next day, I decided to give myself a break and went out to buy groceries. The monotonous routine of the store usually helped me clear my mind, but today I felt as though I was gliding across the surface of reality, unable to truly connect with it. Even my usual route home seemed unfamiliar somehow. As I passed through the park, my eyes caught sight of a familiar figure by the fountain. Lewis. He was sitting with his head bowed, a book in his hands. His posture was relaxed, yet there was something contradictory about it, like he was trying to hide in the shadow of the trees while simultaneously inviting attention. I slowed my pace, unsure whether to approach him. But before I could make up my mind, Lewis raised his head and met my gaze. He smiled, a soft, almost imperceptible smile that felt like an invitation. Turning away was no longer an option. What are you reading? I asked as I walked closer. The question was casual, but I was genuinely curious about what could captivate him so deeply. Lewis tilted the book so I could see the cover. It was some kind of novel, the title unfamiliar to me. Some classic literature, he replied. Sometimes books help you understand yourself better. Are you reading anything right now? I shrugged, a little embarrassed. I don't always have the time. Sometimes I pick up something light, just as a distraction. Distraction? He repeated, raising an eyebrow slightly. You seem to use that word a lot. Maybe, I admitted, trying not to let my embarrassment show. But don't you? He paused for a moment, looking at the water in the fountain as though it held the answer. Maybe. But sometimes I read not to distract myself, but to focus, to dive into someone else's story and understand my own. I couldn't help but smile. His reasoning struck me as both profound and a little naive. But I couldn't deny that there was some truth to it. Interesting philosophy, I noted. But don't other people's stories sometimes make things even more confusing? Lewis gave me a serious look, narrowing his eyes slightly. Only if you're afraid to see yourself from the outside. Are you afraid? I hesitated. His bluntness had caught me off guard again. I averted my gaze, searching for an answer that wouldn't reveal too much. Sometimes, but I think that's normal. He nodded, as if satisfied with my response. We talked for a while longer, about books, about life, about how small things can shape our days. I was surprised by the depth of his thoughts. Lewis knew more about literature than I had expected and spoke in a way that made me want to listen. As I finally prepared to leave, he said something unexpectedly. You know, I think books are like mirrors. You can see whatever you want in them, but sometimes they show you things you've been trying to hide. I didn't respond. I simply smiled and nodded. But his words lingered with me, like a shadow following me all the way home. The morning began unusually calm. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the first rays of sunlight gently spread across the garden. This was my place of solitude, where I could allow myself a brief respite from responsibilities and the thoughts that often wouldn't leave me alone. But today, something disrupted that silence. Good morning, came Lewis's voice from behind me. I turned around. He was standing in the doorway, a mug of coffee in hand, his expression still slightly drowsy. Lewis wasn't one to wake up this early, usually opting to sleep in after his late shifts. His sudden appearance was unexpected. Good morning, I replied. You're up early. He shrugged and stepped closer, glancing out the window at the garden. I thought I could help you, he said with a slight smile. Help with what? I asked, raising an eyebrow in surprise. With the garden, of course, he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. I don't think you'd turn down an extra pair of hands. I hesitated. The garden was my refuge, a place where I found peace. I usually preferred working there alone, but for some reason, the idea of spending this morning with Louis didn't seem so bad. All right, I said. But fair warning, it's not as easy as it looks. His smile widened. I'm willing to take that risk. Soon, we were both out in the garden. Louis armed with a spade, and me with a pair of gloves for pulling weeds. The soil was soft from recent rain, and the work went faster than usual. We chatted about little things, about how challenging it was to care for plants, and how he had never realized just how much effort went into keeping a garden in shape. You know, I used to think a garden was just neatly trimmed grass and flowers, he said, tossing aside another clump of weeds. But it's a whole battle with nature. I laughed. Yes, a battle. Sometimes it feels like the garden reflects life. You're constantly pulling things out, replanting, tending to it, and only then does it stay alive. He looked at me with an unexpected seriousness. That's a good metaphor, but it's not always clear which weeds to pull and which ones to leave. Sometimes even the weeds are beautiful. I looked away, hiding my discomfort. His words felt as though they carried a meaning beyond the garden. Maybe, I said. But if you leave too many weeds, the garden might die. Louis nodded but didn't respond. We continued working, the warm sun growing brighter. At one point, he unexpectedly broke the silence. Have you ever wondered why we hold on to what we have? Even when it's not really what we want? His question stopped me in my tracks. I sank to the ground, pulling off my gloves with a sigh. I think it's because we're afraid of losing even what little we have. It feels safer than taking a risk and ending up with nothing. Louis sat down next to me, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze was fixed on the ground, but I knew he was absorbing every word. And what if you already feel lost? Then what? I looked at him. His voice carried such raw sincerity that I couldn't ignore the question. Then maybe it's time to search for what truly makes you happy, I said softly. He lifted his head and met my eyes. In that moment, I felt as though he was searching for an answer, not only in my words, but also in my expression. I looked away, standing up. We should finish before the sun gets too hot, I said. Louis nodded and silently returned to his work. But that conversation lingered with me for the rest of the day. The evening settled over the house with its usual quietness. Paul, my husband, had fallen asleep on the couch as he often did, half covered by a throw blanket. His soft snoring created an illusion of calm that always masked the real emptiness between us. I sat in the kitchen, flipping through an old cookbook, though cooking was the last thing on my mind. The sound of footsteps pulled me out of my trance. Louis entered the kitchen with a mug of hot cocoa in hand. His appearances had become so frequent that they no longer surprised me, but this time there was something different in his expression. Something that made me close the book and look up at him. Such quiet, he remarked, leaning against the counter. I can't remember the last time the house felt this peaceful. Paul usually falls asleep right after dinner, I replied with a faint smile. I think it's his way of forgetting. Louis gave me a thoughtful look, as if weighing my words. Then he sat across from me, placing his mug on the table. I guess we all find ways to forget, he said softly, tracing the rim of his mug with his finger. I'm just not sure anymore why I came back here. I looked at him, trying to discern what he really meant. This is your home, Louis, I said, hoping to reassure him. It's a place where you'll always be welcome. He smirked, but there was no joy in it. Home? Do you really think so? I feel like a stranger here. Like everything around me is a reminder of what I didn't become. His words landed heavily, like a stone dropped into still water. I didn't know how to respond. The sense of confusion and longing in his voice struck too close to home, echoing feelings I often carried but never voiced. "You know," I said after a long pause, "sometimes I'm not sure I belong either. But I think we can create our place if we figure out what we need for it." Lewis looked up at me, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite define. "And you? Do you know what you need?" he asked quietly. His question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came. He looked at me as if he wanted the truth, even the truth I was afraid to admit. "I'm not sure," I finally said. "Maybe I've been trying to figure that out all along." Lewis nodded, as though he understood me better than I understood myself. He picked up his mug and took a sip of cocoa. We sat in a silence that, for once, didn't feel oppressive. When he stood and headed for the door, I called out to him, "Lewis." He turned back. "Thank you for sharing. It matters." He smiled faintly but didn't reply, just gave a slight nod before disappearing through the doorway. After he left, I felt an odd mixture of relief and unease. That conversation left a mark, one I knew would stay with me for a long time. The weekend began with a light morning rain that left the garden fresh and glistening. I was preparing for a trip out of town, having found an ad for some old gardening tools being sold for next to nothing. As I stepped out onto the porch, I saw Lewis already standing by the car, holding a bottle of water. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the road. "Yes, I need to pick up something for the garden." "Want some company?" he offered, leaning against the car. "Long drive and we could talk." I hesitated. The trip would mean hours on the road and conversations I couldn't avoid, but turning him down didn't feel right. "All right," I said, "but I should warn you, it might be boring." "I'll survive," he said with a grin. The drive turned out to be longer than I had anticipated. We passed endless fields and forests, stretching out like they were part of some aimless journey. The first few miles went by in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the rare kind of silence in which you can simply be. "When I was a kid," Lewis began unexpectedly, "my dad and I used to take drives like this. He always said the road was the best time for conversations because you couldn't escape." I smiled, but his words stirred something in me. They reminded me of how Paul had once loved long drives too. Now, he barely found time for moments like these. "What did you talk about?" I asked, hoping to keep the conversation going. Lewis shrugged. "All sorts of things." He'd ask about my plans, my dreams. Back then, I wanted to travel. Thought I'd see the world and find a place that felt like home. But as you can see, I'm still here. His voice carried a hint of bitterness. I could tell those dreams still mattered to him, even if he wouldn't admit it outright. "Why didn't you go?" I asked gently. "Life got in the way," he replied simply, his eyes never leaving the road. "Money, work, responsibilities. It all pulls you in so fast that before you know it, you're stuck in a place you never meant to be." His words hit too close to home. I stayed quiet, searching for a response that wouldn't sound hollow. Instead, I decided to share something of my own. "I used to want to travel too," I said. "I dreamed of seeing Europe, small historic towns, but like you said, life got in the way." Lewis glanced at me with a brief smile that carried a mix of understanding and sadness. "Guess we're more alike than it seems," he said. When we arrived at the place to pick up the tools, our conversation paused. We loaded the old, well-worn spades and hoes into the car and started the journey back. But on the way, Lewis suggested stopping by a lake. The lake was small but wonderfully serene. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, painting the water in golden-orange hues. We sat on a wooden bench by the shore, watching the gentle waves lap against the stones. "It's nice here," Lewis said, breaking the silence. "Do you ever just go somewhere for a view like this?" I shook my head. "Rarely. It always feels like there's something more important to do." "Maybe you should rethink your priorities," he said. his gaze fixed on the water. Sometimes moments like this give you more than anything else. We sat there a while longer, saying little. But in that moment, for the first time in a long while, I felt truly alive. Not just existing, but savoring the moment. When we got back home, Paul was already asleep, and the house had returned to its usual quiet. But I knew this trip would stay with me for a long time, along with the conversations we'd had alone with the road and the sunset. The days following our trip passed in the usual flurry of chores, cleaning, shopping, and tending to the garden. Yet something within me had shifted. The memory of my conversation with Lewis, the sunset by the lake, and his words about what truly matters lingered in my mind, quietly challenging the foundation of my life. One evening, as I prepared dinner, Lewis walked into the kitchen. He looked as if he had been gathering his thoughts for a long time. "What are you up to?" he asked, nodding toward the table where I was chopping vegetables. "Just making a salad," I replied. "How was your day?" "All right," he said, sitting down at the table. But his expression betrayed that his thoughts were elsewhere. "Can I ask you something?" I paused, sensing that this conversation wouldn't be a simple one. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone calm. "If you had the chance to start over, would you take it?" he asked, his gaze so intense that I almost lost my grip on the knife. "I don't know," I admitted, setting the knife down. "Sometimes I think about it, but it's terrifying to leave everything behind." "And if fear wasn't a factor?" he pressed, leaning forward. "If you could do whatever you wanted without consequences, what would you choose?" "I suppose I'd try to live differently," I said at last. "Travel, discover new things. But those are just dreams, Lewis. Dreams don't always align with reality." He nodded, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "What's stopping you from trying? You talk like everything is set in stone, but is it really?" I didn't know how to respond. His words were simple, yet they carried a challenge I couldn't ignore. Why not? What was holding me back? Habit? Fear? Or something else entirely? "And you?" I asked, turning the question back on him. "If you could start over, what would you do?" Lewis smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I'd leave, finally let myself stop worrying about what I owe anyone. Just start living the way I want to." "Then why don't you?" I asked, echoing his own question. He was silent for a long moment before answering. "Maybe I'm waiting, but I don't even know for what. Maybe for someone to tell me I don't have to stay, or for something to change to make it easier to leave." "Sometimes waiting is pointless, Lewis," I said quietly. "Sometimes you just have to decide." He looked at me with gratitude, but also with a deep sadness, as if he knew I was right, but wasn't ready to accept it. Then he stood, taking his mug from the table. "Thanks for answering," he said before walking out. I was left alone in the kitchen, feeling as though the conversation had upended something inside me. Lewis had forced me to confront questions I had long avoided, and now they demanded answers. The evening was quiet and peaceful. Paul, as usual, was watching TV, while I sat on the veranda, enjoying the cool night air. The moonlight softly illuminated the garden, making the leaves glisten as if dusted with silver. I held a cup of tea in my hands, listening to the steady chorus of crickets serenading from the grass. Just as I was about to get up, the door to the veranda creaked open, and Lewis stepped out. In his hands was a guitar, old and slightly worn. I remembered him bringing it with him when he moved in, but I had never heard him play it before. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Not at all," I replied, surprised by his question. "Do you play often?" "I used to," he said, walking closer. "Not so much now, but sometimes music feels like the best way to understand yourself, or to forget." He sat down on the veranda steps and began to play. The melody was soft, gentle, but laced with a touch of melancholy. It was unfamiliar, perhaps something he had composed himself. I listened in silence, letting the notes weave through the quiet night and fill the space between us. That was beautiful, I said when he finished. What was it? Something of my own, he said, staring at the strings. I wrote it a long time ago, back when I thought music would be my future. But as always, life had other plans. Why did you give it up? I asked, unable to suppress my curiosity. He gave a small, bittersweet smile. Because sometimes it's easier to choose what feels right than what you really want. His words hung in the air, as if he wasn't just talking about music. They resonated with something deep within me, stirring up unresolved thoughts and feelings. You could start again, I said softly. Sometimes all it takes is trying. Lewis looked at me. His gaze was serious, but not heavy, as though he was searching for something in my words, or in my eyes. And you? He asked. Could you start again? The question froze me in place. I didn't know how to answer. The evening air seemed heavier, and the cricket's song was the only constant. Words stuck in my throat, yet I couldn't look away from him. Maybe, I finally said, but only if I knew it was worth it. He nodded as if he understood more than I had said. Then he began to play again, the melody this time calmer, tinged with a faint sense of hope. I wasn't sure how he interpreted my words, but after a few moments he leaned toward me. And then, it happened. We kissed. The moment felt surreal, both unexpected and inevitable. We stayed there a while longer, neither of us saying much. My thoughts swirled in endless loops, unable to settle on any one thing. When the night finally deepened and the garden fell even quieter, I was left with the undeniable reality of what had happened. I didn't know what to think, or what to do next. The past few days felt like a delicate web being stretched tighter and tighter. Paul had begun to notice something in my behavior. He started asking more questions, not direct, but probing enough to make me uncomfortable. You've been a bit preoccupied lately, he said over dinner, not lifting his eyes from his plate. Is everything okay? Of course, I replied with a strained smile. Just busy with things. But his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than usual. He sensed something. He didn't know what exactly, but his intuition told him that something invisible was shifting between us. I avoided his eyes, focusing instead on my glass of wine. Even our nosy neighbor, Jennifer, known for her keen interest in other people's lives, didn't miss her chance to comment. The next day, she cornered me outside the grocery store. As usual, she wore a bright smile, but her tone carried more curiosity than sincerity. You and Lewis seem to get along well, she said, hefting her shopping bag. I saw you two in the garden the other day. It was sweet. Yes, I replied, doing my best to sound natural. He's just been helping out. He has some free time at the moment. Jennifer studied me a little too intently, as if trying to read something in my expression. Then she smiled again and added, That's nice. Family should stay close, especially in times like these. Her words sounded innocent enough, but the tone sent a chill through me. What did she mean? Was it just a general observation, or was there a hidden implication? Later that evening, I found myself sitting next to Lewis on the garden bench. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension that had been building over days. How was your day? I asked, trying to break the ice. Fine, he replied without looking at me. Though I think Paul's starting to suspect something. I froze, caught off guard by his bluntness. Lewis turned to me with a faint smile, but his eyes betrayed unease. He doesn't know anything, I said quickly. He's probably just in one of his moods. Maybe, Lewis said, but it's making me think. All of this, it can't go on forever, can it? I know, I said quietly. We need to be careful. Lewis stared at me for a long moment before nodding. Careful is good, he said. But sometimes I wonder, is it worth it? His words hung in the air like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. I didn't know how to respond. Instead, we both sat in silence, staring at the garden that no longer felt as serene as it once had. The night was particularly dark, with only the faint glow of the moon casting light over the garden. I stood at the bedroom window, staring at the shadows of the trees, trying to quiet the whirlwind of thoughts in my mind. They flitted about like persistent moths around a lamp. I knew it was time to end this. It had gone too far. Once everyone in the house was asleep, I slipped quietly into the garden. Louis was already there, as if he had been waiting. He sat on the wooden bench, leaning slightly against the backrest, gazing at the stars. The moonlight illuminated his face, making his expression even more pensive. "You came," he said softly without turning around. "We need to talk," I replied, walking closer. My voice sounded firm, but inside I was trembling. I sat down beside him, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. My hands were clasped tightly, and I focused on them, trying to keep myself steady. Louis remained silent, waiting for me to continue. "We can't go on like this," I finally said, barely above a whisper. "This isn't right." "You know I'm right." Louis was quiet for a long time, then exhaled deeply. "I know," he said, "but that doesn't make it any easier." "It has to stop before it gets worse," I went on, "before we destroy what we already have. You have a future, Louis. You can't waste it on this." "Do you really think it's that simple?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with pain. "That I can just forget about you?" "You have to," I said firmly, finally turning to look at him. "It's better for both of us." Louis looked at me for what felt like an eternity, as if trying to memorize every detail of my face. Then he turned away. "I understand," he said at last, "but I can't promise it will be easy." "It won't be easy for me either," I admitted, "but it's the right thing to do." He nodded, and in that silent agreement, there was more understanding than words could convey. Then Louis stood, glanced at me one last time, and said, "Thank you for being honest." He walked away, leaving me alone in the garden. I sat on the bench, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders, but at the same time, an emptiness settled in its place. I knew it was the right decision, yet I couldn't ignore the feeling that a part of me was walking away with him. A few days after that conversation, Louis left. His sudden departure wasn't a surprise. I had known he'd been planning to leave this house, this town, for some time. Paul mentioned that Louis had found a job in another state, and he even seemed pleased that his son had decided to get serious. But for me, it was more than just a change of circumstances. The days began to feel strangely empty. The garden no longer brought comfort. Chores became mechanical, and dinners with Paul were steeped in silence. I tried to convince myself that everything had returned to normal, that this story had ended the way it was supposed to. Yet inside, something felt incomplete, like a melody that stops abruptly mid-note. One day, while sorting through papers in search of a receipt, I found a letter. It was a plain envelope, no return address, but my name was written in a hand I couldn't fail to recognize. My heart raced as I opened it. Inside was a small sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat and precise, but each line seemed to carry the weight of careful effort. "I know we made the right choice, but that doesn't mean I can forget. You made me see myself differently, to understand what I truly want. If you ever feel ready to change your life, to find yourself, I'll be waiting. But even if that day never comes, know that you'll always remain in my memory. Thank you for everything." L.I. read the letter several times before folding it back up. My heart was filled with a strange mixture of pain and solace. Louis had left, but his words remained, leaving an imprint I knew would never fade. I tucked the letter away in the box with the rest of the documents and tried to move on. Paul noticed nothing. He was absorbed in his routines, oblivious to the fact that I was no longer the same person I used to be. But I knew I had changed. Louis, his questions, his perspective, his openness had left a mark on me. Each morning I asked myself, what if I really could start over? but the answer was always the same. Not yet. This story would stay with me forever, but I didn't know if I had the strength to take the next step. And yet, deep down, I understood that someday, perhaps, I would find that moment. A moment when the past no longer held me, and the future seemed brighter. Then, maybe, I would take the letter out of the box and realize I was ready for change. For now, I simply lived, carrying the memory of someone who had once looked at me like no one else ever had.